Hey, everybody. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about state. And I actually think this is one of the most probably either misunderstood and under discussed areas that can have one of the biggest impacts in our life. I, I want to say maybe it was 2 years ago, I actually used a habit tracker app called like Habit Bull. And I measured my state each day, just as an overall kind of idea of where I was on a scale of 1 to 10. A little bit subjective, of course, but what gets measured gets managed, right? So I started thinking about that and allowing myself, like, hey, if something happened and I'd process through that information. I just wouldn't stay there for very long, assuming that the emotional, mental state I was in wasn't beneficial for the situation, beneficial for myself, for others, whatever it may be, right? Maybe I got angry or upset about something, and holding on to that anger, holding on to being upset about that thing, wasn't um, beneficial for me, for anyone really, in a situation like that, right? And so I'd allow myself to experience that, go through that, but I would just what I was looking to do over time was I was looking to get more agency, more control over my own state, my own emotional state, my own energy, where my intentions were, and just getting control of that. And so let me circle back real quick to what is state, right? For those of you who may not be, thinking about this, the way I think of our state is it's our emotion, right? So it's the emotional state we're in, it's the energy level that we have, and then it's also our intention, right? So when we talk about how beliefs and biology, and state all kind of impact each other, the mindset portion is a little bit of a reflection of our beliefs, right? So that's kind of where that crosses over, to understand where's our mindset at, and that tells us to a little bit where we're putting our attention in that moment. And that's going to tell us a little bit about our emotional state, because where our attention goes is where we're putting our energy, and where we're going to experience and feel what we're perceiving, both whether it's in our minds, or whether it's something that we're visually seeing or hearing or whatever it may be. That's what we're experiencing, right? So there's that, and then our energy level is, from a biology perspective, if we're very low energy, say we just couldn't sleep the night before, you got an hour of sleep and you're just exhausted, like that's going to impact your state as well, right? So your energy level is a big part of your state. And when you I don't think it's a hard conclusion for all of us to make, is when we're in a low energy state, or we're in a bad emotional state, when maybe our intentions aren't in the right place, we're generally not going to get as good of results. We're not going to have as good an impact in a lot of the situations that we're in, right? That doesn't mean that you can't use, there might be appropriate times to be in a state of anger, and that could be actually beneficial, for that situation. But the more you kind of uncover, it tends to be more rare, in those situations, that you actually need that. That tends to be more of a pattern that we've just created, and someone else is actually controlling or influencing you in those scenarios. And so you are then responding, as opposed to, or reacting as opposed to responding, and choosing what is kind of the best way to be in that moment. So all of these things come into play in the way we experience life, and managing our state, getting control of our state. um, I personally think will be one of the most impactful things for people in their entire lives. So back to when I was measuring this, like I did this over, I want to say it was 170 days, and I wanted to be, I just said, somewhere between an 8 and 10. Like if I was measuring on from a 1 to 10 scale, with one being the worst state possible. I was angry, I was depressed, I was like that. And the duration of those was really long period of time. So I spent the majority of the day just, wallowing in my pity, or I was in a fear state for a lot for the day. So with one being like pretty much the entire day, I spent my time, the frequency, the intensity was really high of those emotions. So you have like frequency, you have intensity, and then duration. Like, so it wasn't that I had those and they were happening often and they were really intense, but it was also they were going on for like hours, as opposed to me being able to recorrect and take a minute or two and then kind of get back on track. Right. So that's kind of what I was thinking of, as like one being that side, right? And then looking at 10, like being like I was pretty much on cloud nine all day. And, I was able to um, see stimulus come in that would normally um, have me react in a certain way. And I was choosing how to respond. And I was diving deeper into understanding the meaning of what I was assigning to that. And I was assigning meaning appropriately, in a way that was beneficial for everyone, for myself, for the world, that I really thought would be beneficial, to the process, to the outcome, to the people involved. And so I was responding in a much better way. I was coming from a place of love, from a place of abundance. And just I was really operating at a very high level. And if I and so as we start to kind of look through that spectrum, it's like we're all going to have times throughout the day that something happens and we get frustrated with it or whatever, and that's completely normal. And so like like 8 for me in my mind was like, yeah, I got frustrated throughout the day a few times, but I wasn't letting I was getting better at lowering the intensity of that. So it wasn't that I was getting like some little thing. You get a coffee drink and you let that ruin your whole day, right? It's like you normal coffee drink you get every day. You get that coffee drink and it's bad, and you're just like, this ruins my whole day, right? And that is often what happens for a lot of people, is we let like a matter of a few seconds experience of our day influence our state, becomes a mood over time, right? So our like in the moment, if you think about it this way, your the way you live each moment then compounds, right? So you have your emotional state in the moment. And then from there, after you have that for a period of time, then that might be said you have this mood, right? So you're in this kind of mood for a longer period of time. And then from there, um, it starts to, over a longer period of time, becomes part of your personality. That's just, other people as well as yourself would start to reflect that as part of your personality. And so all the little things we do consistently over time become bigger and often parts of our identity and who we are. So to come back to that, because I think it's an important distinction, and I think it's a great practice. um, I did it to because I actually wanted to test and kind of, I knew what gets measured gets managed, right? So I knew, like, well, let me look at this on a day-to-day basis and actually pay attention to it. And when we start to put our attention on something, right, we often start to improve it, right? Just by literally by measuring it, by starting to do that, we start to put our attention on it and we start to get better at it because we are paying our attention, our energy towards it. So I started to do that, and the Habit Bowl app was really cool. It would tell you when you were going on streaks, and I was my goal was to be between an 8 and 10, right? So it wasn't to be perfect by any means. That's not. Uh, I think I rarely had days where I was a 10, like where I was on cloud nine all day long. I had a lot of days where I was a 9, and I had a number of days where I was an 8 too, where it was like deal with a lot of challenging things throughout the day, and big decisions and challenging decisions and problems and solutions. And so I wanted to be better for my team, better for my family, better for my community. And I knew that if I could be in a better state consistently, I would be able to be better consistently for them. So um, I remember being on a long streak, which was like, I want to say it was like 70 days or something like that, where I was between an 8 and a 10, which for me was a really big accomplishment. And then I had a day where I forget what it was. There was a number of things going on. I think, I had some challenges with at work. I had some challenges in my relationship with my wife, and I let myself live like that. The small moments, I let myself stay there. So the duration for a longer period of time, and that's what often happens is when you get into a state, it's like that groove, right? Where you're, if we're going to tie this into the riverbed, and I'll kind of share with you how this kind of integrates in my riverbed analogy. But when you get in that groove, it sometimes feels hard to get out of that groove, right? So when you get in that frustrated state where you often the focus is on yourself. Often you tend to think, it's not what you're doing, it's what other people are doing. So there's a lot of those kind of areas where you get to that point where anytime you're starting to think about, hey, this is someone else's fault and they did this or they're taking this from me, you're getting into that state where you're probably in like more of a frustrated state. You're in a state of scarcity. You're in a state. And what's interesting about those is when we talk about your body, there's this is where it can be hard, because when you get into those states, it literally has an impact on your body, and your nervous system changes, your body changes. There's a lot of things, and you've probably heard me say this before, but like when you get into some of those states, it literally drops your immune system. If you're in like a fight or flight type state where your sympathetic nervous system is firing, you got adrenaline going, and things like that, where it's like um, your immune system drops for a period of time. And what happens is often we get addicted. These patterns become addicting. Our emotional states become addicting in a couple different ways, because they often will meet certain needs of ours. So for me as a business owner, and I know a lot of business owners out there, there is what feels like power in when their nervous system goes, they start taking action, and they're often a little more frustrated and angry, and they're doing things, but they're actually doing things, right? So they're getting things done, and they're moving things forward, and they're making things happen. And for them, that with like fuel for them. Um, and what ends up happening is it actually, and what's interesting in a lot of cases is it works. Like, you get things done, you move things forward, you see progress. And so you start creating all these associations that is actually a good thing, that's what needs to get done. And it's very easy that also in those situations, you tend to not utilize teamwork as much in those situations. You tend to put more on yourself in those situations. You tend to actually disempower and make other people feel that they can't do things as well. So you tend to get in a point where it's like, if something's got to be done right, I got to do it myself, right? So when people start saying those kind of things, that if you think about it as a business owner, that's like one of the worst things that you could possibly think. If you're trying to grow a business and in your mind you keep saying like, if something's going to be done right, I got to do it myself. That means you're going to be a business operator for the majority of your life. As long as you have that mental state, you're not going to be able to build a business where other people are empowered and actually doing things better than you, because you're constantly looking at it and you're basically pulling the rug out from under them in a lot of cases, where it's saying, hey, you didn't do this right, like I have to take this over, right? And so it's really important to understand and have that longer term vision and understand in each situation, whether it's a relationship with a significant other, if it's a relationship with a client, whether it's a relationship with an internal client, your team member, whether it's a relationship with yourself, that you are not necessarily um, only looking at the short term as far as some of the patterns and how those have benefited you in the past, and maybe how those are doing it, because you have to look at, okay, what got me here won't necessarily get me to where I want to go, right? Whether that's in a relationship, whether that's wherever, and maybe the things that have been working for you have been working for you up to this point, but how can we get better, right? How can we continue to improve and grow? And that often what ends up happening in everything's a relationship, right? Whether it's with yourself, with a significant other, with a client, with your team, whatever it may be, there's always that relationship. And in every um, relationship, there can be different ways of interacting, and you can raise and always improve the ways you interact with others, right? So and I'm thinking about this from a business standpoint because I think it is so applicable. And at least for me, I'll talk a little bit about sports just because I think it's a great analogy and how those two kind of come into play. But for me, I went through the experience multiple times where, so a stimulus happened, trigger happened, maybe a client maybe they weren't even upset, but their email seemed upset about something. And then that created a cascade event where it was like, okay, like, hey, client's upset about this, like we need to do things. And my I would then put stress, and the part of the intentions coming from a good area. It's not, it's, when you have a lot of passion and you want to do great work and you want to, make sure that people are seeing that and understanding that and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of it's coming from the right point, right? So there's a lot of good thoughts behind that. But what would often happen is I would then, for myself, I would go into a state where that stress and pressure would be being transferred to the team, right? So in any organization, any team, the the leader is one of the biggest limiting factors and one of the biggest influences on the state of the team and how they're performing, right? And so they can have a really positive effect, but they can also have a really negative effect. And as the state of the what is often kind of considered more of a leader, not that everyone shouldn't be a leader, they all are in different ways, but someone who's taking that leadership mantle and has that expectation to some extent, that often transfers. And so what would happen is that would transfer to to my team, and they would feel the stress. And there's a lot of different things that come from that. Sometimes they get things done and it would work for them too. But if you think about it over the long run, does that create really good job satisfaction? Probably not for a lot of people, right? Um, and what's interesting is the way from my organization, the way we served customers increased drastically when we went from less of a reactive state and more just having a high level of emotional intelligence and trying to understand. And so we'd first look to understand and just chat with the client and not go into it with expectations that they're upset, because often they weren't. It was a real simple thing where it was like, hey, the email came off like they were upset, but they weren't, or they maybe were a little frustrated about something, but once you talked to them and said, oh no, that's already been done and it was sent via email, but it's in your spam folder, or check your spam folder. And they're like, oh, okay. And so there's all these kind of like miscommunications or different things that can happen on a daily basis. And so why let all those things influence how you perform and the way you experience life at the end of the day, for me, is the biggest thing. And if you can experience life in a better way, you can actually tend to be better for others, and you can actually have more of a positive ripple effect in your local area. You can like your team that you're working with, the friends, the community that you're a part of. You can have more positive impacts in that way because of that state. So I think just that in of itself is huge. But there's also like if you think about it from a sports standpoint, um, there's a lot of different analogies around sports, and it's important for people to understand like what roles and what their expectations are, and like it's on any team, right? But if someone goes down and they run down for a layup and they miss an easy layup, um, old school coaching and old school things would have been to basically use pain, reinforcement, to basically have them not do that. What ends up happening is it creates a downward spiral of they miss that, and then immediately, rather than resetting and just being back on focusing on what's important to them because they can't change anything that just happened there, they keep focusing on that mistake that was made, right? And so when they're in a game, right? So this is like you being on stage. If you're doing speaking and you make a misstep, right, and you are doing a presentation and you say something really wrong or horrible, or you make a fool of yourself or whatever it is, and then that whole entire time, the rest of the time, rather than course correcting, you're focused on that, like performance goes down, right? And so it's important, especially when we're on stage, when we're performing, when we're in often what would be called like the zone or in a flow state, where we're doing that. It's important that we are not too self-critical in those positions. That doesn't mean we don't look to correct mistakes. It just means that when we're in those periods, we are not too critical. You want people to, in a business where you encourage innovation, you want to make sure that mistakes are okay, right? And that people learn from those mistakes, because if no one's willing to make a mistake and doesn't know that it's okay, and that if they make a mistake that they're not going to be, you know uh, I don't know, put up in front of everyone and made fun of. I think that's one of our biggest fears, is that, like, we're going to make a mistake. What we want to encourage is we want you to go up on stage, and if you make a mistake, then great job. Like, anyone else who would like make fun of you is just not even worth taking their input from, because they're not getting on stage themselves, right? So if there's someone who would get on stage, then listen to them and take that reinforcement. But while you're in the game, you know you don't need to be doing too much course correcting from that standpoint, because you've already built those habits. Now, that doesn't mean that, hey, like, we'll come back, we'll like look at a project and say, hey, what did we do well, what could we do better next time, like, in what wins can we celebrate. It's the same kind of stuff you can do on an individual level, is look at that and go, hey, like, not beat yourself up too much, but like, hey, what did I do well, right? What could I have done better, and like, what can I celebrate about this, right? So there's those kind of elements that I think are really important. And a lot of times, once you start to understand the power of state, then you start to realize that, like, let me tie this into the riverbed analogy for you. So you can think of our state, um, like almost like a vibration or movement to some extent. What's interesting is, so when emotion and energy and intention, all those things happen, our vibration literally changes. Like, as humans, they tracked our brain waves, and there's different brainwave states that we're in. We're literally vibrating at a different level, at different frequencies, all that kind of stuff. And so if you think about the analogy of the riverbed, let's imagine for a second you're in a highly just emotional, and maybe you've lost someone close to you recently. Or you're just really sad for whatever reason, right? And so it's just pouring down rain, and the waters are higher than normal. They're just, it's not calm, things are just flowing through really quickly in those riverbeds, right? So when you think about emotional state, that's kind of how I think about it is you can have traumatic experiences that totally end up being like an earthquake in a lot of ways where it will shift things so much because you had this traumatic experience and your underlying beliefs, your underlying associations of pain and pleasure, um, the experience that you had with that can literally change and take these current structures that have been built and change them in whole new ways, right? So it's important to understand for a couple of reasons. One is that when people have traumatic experiences, there's a lot of elements that can change, and it's important to realize that on a spectrum of traumatic experiences, everyone's had traumatic experiences. It's just the way our brain and body works. Once you start to understand the way we operate and the way we take in information from a young age, we've all had to some extent what feels to us as traumatic experiences, and the way we've imprinted that in our body and our brain, our wiring is more like a traumatic experience. The positive aspect of that is realizing that you can literally make a change. Like you can shift this pattern to a new pattern like that. Like coming to that realization that that can happen, that I can just, because all it is if you think about it, it's a layers upon layers of these mental constructs, these associations that have been created, along with some of our underlying biology that's like instinctual to some extent, um, that we can literally shift and head a new direction at any time. Now, why these traumatic experiences happen, or one of the reasons why that traumatic experience kind of comes into play in that, and why I'm using earthquake as a thing, is it's like movement, right? Emotion, energy, intention. The state is more like kind of movement. Your thoughts, emotions, actions might be flowing quickly, right? So you might be in a state where you're just like your brain is racing, right? You might be in a state where everything's slow. And if you've seen the episode where we talk about fast and slow and how important, so fast being our subconscious, where we're operating on pre-programmed past things, and slow being where we have the ability to respond and to like respond from not just our past programming, but respond and actually change our programming, then you can see that in order to do that, you usually need to slow those things down, right? So we can slow the water down to a trickle, right? And we can create new underlying patterns that will support the flow of thoughts going future in ways that are more beneficial and healthy for us. So you have all these different emotional states, you have different levels of energy and vibration, and how those come into play in your day-to-day experiences is critical. So if you did one thing and just said, hey, on a 90-day like macro level, I'm going to measure my state just in general each day of like how well I did at managing my state, responding, um, seeing stimuluses and not necessarily assigning right away a thought or a meaning to that, but getting to the point, and this is the superpower, is getting to the point where you can assign meaning in a way that's beneficial, as opposed to just relying on the past programming to assign meaning. And often a lot of that past programming is based on things that you didn't necessarily intentionally choose, right? And there's sometimes emotion, there's fear, there's scarcity, there's different things that are often tied to that. So when you can start to do that, and you can actually say, okay, hey, and so you're thinking throughout the day is like, stimulus happens, you're like, how can this be a good thing? How can this be a learning opportunity? How can I grow from this? What in this is going to allow me to give to others more, right? Whether that's compassion, understanding, whether it's ability to teach someone else how to respond. Um, how can I literally be grateful for this challenge that was put in front of me? How am I? So, like, you can come up with your own series of questions, questions are really important that guide our attention, right? So questions guide our attention and help create that new pathway because questions guide our attention, right? If I say, don't think of a pink elephant, you think of a pink elephant, right? But if you ask yourself, which I used this example before, but when I used to have all these situational unconscious questions, started realizing I was using like, what would taste good? The answer to what would taste good was something salty, crunchy, cheesy, whatever, right? You know, that was the answer. And so just by changing the question to what would help me feel good, nourish my body, and help me reach my goals, like that's a very different answer. And it puts my attention in a different way. My attention is also then aligned with my intention long term, as opposed to the other one, what's not aligned with my intention, right? So understanding that is, I think, an important part. But coming back to understanding kind of states and understanding how this kind of flows in with the riverbed analogy and how like the shifting of earth underneath can change is it's literally like it, the thing I don't want is I don't want you to think of the riverbed as being something that is so solid that it can't be changed. This is like a visual construct in your mind that you've created of the riverbed, right? And this is all the beliefs and all the mental constructs that have been created that flows in, right? So by changing those things, by changing that mental construct, by changing the underlying beliefs, you can change the underlying pattern. And so whether that's an emotional state or whether it's learning to set your intention, setting your intention is a great way to be very more mindful of what state you want to be in. So if you're coming into a conversation with a team member, you might, want to set your intention for what kind of experience you want to be in that, and that's going to allow you to influence them in a more positive way, to be there for them in a more positive way. So intentions are a really important part of it. From if you're coming from a place of love, joy, from a place of abundance, from a place of compassion, like you're going to have a much better impact on the person that you're communicating with. Now, I heard some people right there in my mind, I heard some people saying, no, like this is what gets people to act in certain cases, and that can be fear, right? And if you've developed that habit, that probably happened for you at younger ages, and then at some point you learned that I can get people to do things by fear, by manipulation, by these different things, right? And the problem with that is, well, there's multiple problems, but the just from a utilitarian standpoint, it's not going to last for a long period of time. Um, that's only going to last for a short period of time until that person that is being oppressed is, in that way, the person that you are using fear to manipulate, using anger to get to do what you want to do, they're eventually going to change, and rightfully so. If you were in that position, you probably wouldn't allow that to happen for very long either. So our emotions are a huge lens in which we experience life. So the frequency and intensity of those emotions are going to be a big part of the way you experience life. If you are in states of low energy, in states of fear and anger and scarcity, more often you're going to experience life in that from that lens. And so a saying I say a lot, and it's attributed to many different people and all this stuff, but it's we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And so as you start to change this lens through which you're experiencing life, the world literally changes outside of you. And the quickest way for us to change the world is by changing ourselves. And a lot of us look for the problem outside of us, and we point at someone else as being the problem, when a large percentage of the problem is inside us. We can overcome almost anything with the right state, right? With the right, you know, tenacity and having like there's so much more that we can do, and we can communicate more effectively. We can show up better. We can, influence people better from the state, like depending on what it is. So whatever it is that you're experiencing life, and you're seeing life in a certain way, right? So think about how all the elements around us influence our state, right? So if we're getting our worldview from like social media, like I just feel for so many people who like are constructing their worldview from social media, because it's this small sliver of algorithmic curated content that people are getting their worldview from, right? And so it's it's both sad and to some extent dangerous and just unhealthy in a lot of ways, um, to do that. But a lot of us are experiencing the world from that lens, right? So where we start to change and start to change our state is by both changing internally first. And so a big part of that is understanding that in order to change our state, there's a couple different things. And actually, one of the um, I would consider one of the top thought leaders in really mastering and understanding your state is Tony Robbins. Like um, he has done so much around this that I would say, like, if you want to dive deeper in understanding how your state impacts the rest of the way you experience life, like that'd be the number one person I would say, like, dive deeper into understanding state, like review all the stuff that he's talked about. He talked about the triad physiology. So the triad of state, one of the things Tony Robbins teaches is physiology, focus, and language, right? So the way you're holding your body affects your state, right? So if you are getting up to speak on stage, and you go up and your head's looking down and your shoulders are rolled forward and your voice is kind of slow, and your like people can literally see your state, right? And that same state, um, you're going to feel more than anyone in that instance, right? You're going to feel that state. The same thing you can do just by pulling your shoulders back, lifting your head up, like it's being pulled up on a string, and by smiling, your state is going to change, and your message is going to change for those people. Now that doesn't mean can't change you can literally change your state for different parts of what you're communicating, right? For it to have the impact you want it to have. Like I'm speaking of actually speaking on stage, or in a more performing in that way. Actors use this a lot in that they understand, in order to get into a certain like character, they have to get into their mind, they have to get into their mental state, the way they use their body, right? And so physiology, when he talks about that, is really, which once you understand this, it's hard to do at first, but once you understand how much your body influences your state, your mind, your mental state, like as long as you can get yourself to do it, like you can use your body in strange ways. You can dance, you can jump around and act boisterous, you can be silly, you can sit there and shake your butt around and like do things that you'd be stupid, and you'll start either laughing or you'll start getting a state like your body, your actual physical body, is such a big part of state. So a lot of times when people don't use their body as much, this is part of the pattern, right? So it's important to make sure that we're taking care of our body, and we're using our body in ways, and the patterns of which we use our body um, comes into play. And so then he also talks about focus. Like if your if your whole day was you had this great day, but you had this one experience at coffee shop when you went in there, and you got a bad drink, and you just keep replaying that over in your mind, and you're just focusing on that part, and that takes over your whole entire day, right? That's going to influence your state because you're focusing on that thing. And so there's a lot of tricks to learn how to change your focus. Um, I'll touch on a couple of them real quick, just because for me these have been really powerful. Not everyone, I don't think, when you're in, like I'm in my own conscious. I don't know how other people think other than what I've learned through psychology and biology and some of the different studies and things like that, and talking to other people and learning that everyone has different personalities and ways of looking at things. Like, I get that, but I still am not in their experience, right? And so it's interesting for me because I, for the longest time, didn't have a lot of control over, at least it didn't feel like I had a lot of control over where my focus was going. It was very distracted often. Um, I can go more into the as I've learned. I've actually learned some of the biology reasons why, some of the pattern reasons why that was the case. I was very so I was very future focused. My At some point, my guess is somewhere probably around age 23 ish, when I was like, I need to do something with my life because I'm living at home with my mom. I switched, and then had a child shortly after that. I switched from being very future focused, and when you're future focused, it's much more dopamine driven. Now, I always had a little bit of that. What may have been diagnosed as ADHD never was diagnosed, but was very kind of distractible. But I was also very I'd say happy-go-lucky. I'd say I was much more in the present moment. But I was still spending time thinking about the future and all that, but I was much more in the present moment. And then I went highly spent time where I was in the future. So part of your state is your focus in the past all the time, right? And you're just thinking about the good old days and what happened in the past, or something you're playing over and over in your mind that just didn't happen and you regret, even though, like, there's no reason to regret anything because you can't change the past. Are you like present, like, and like there with people, so you're actually like listening to them and you're experiencing like that with them, and so you can actually be there for them and be attentive, understanding that there's some downfalls to being present, like you're probably more late to meetings sometimes and things like that. um, you might get in long conversations which are great, but then you miss somebody else because you were so present for that person. So there's some of that. Or is your focus in the future? And when my focus went to the future, like, that was for me something, a pattern that I was like, I loved, and I still really enjoy planning for the future. I think it's one of the things that I'm good at understanding all the different possible scenarios, and calculating, and narrowing things down to potential likely scenarios and things like that. So I enjoy that aspect of it. But I also realized at some point that the future never happens except in the present. And I actually had to retrain myself to go, I need to spend some time in the future to determine what I want that future to look like. But then I need to live in the present so I don't miss out on all the opportunities to align with that. And so that was really a big part of it, is understanding, where am I putting my focus? Is it, in things that are going to serve me and serve others? Is it past, present, future? Is it scarcity? So there's all these different areas that you can start to learn and start to control your focus. And as one of the basic principles of this book is that the way we experience life is a big part of that is how the quality and quantity of our attention, and how well that aligns with our intention, right? Our vision, our values, what we find purposeful and meaningful. Um, so in order for me to get better at aligning my attention, that's something I had to work on a lot. And so that's a big part of our state, is where are we putting our focus, um, and how can we change that? And so one thing, I'd start to get into a spiral where I was telling myself some negative future scenario story, and it's great when you're um, is it frontal lobe? I think it's frontal. Yeah, when you're predicting the future, it's great to think about all the great things, but often not. Our, reptilian brain is saying, well, what are all the things to worry about and look out for, and what are the things that could hurt us, right? And so when you start to create all these possible future scenarios that are harmful, that is also detrimental and can be very stressful as well. So when I got into those spirals where I was like, oh, here's all these possible scenarios where this could go bad, or this could go bad, or this could happen, or that could happen, and you just get on this the downward spiral, as we talk about. Um, I would look at it in my mind. I would actually visualize it as a record spinning and just playing this song, and I would take off the record. And for those of you who don't know what a record is, I'm sure you do. Seen it in a movie or something. There's this disc that has etched into it and needle that kind of plays music. And if you scratch it, it doesn't play that same tune anymore, right? And so I would take that record off the record player and I would just scratch it. I would do all this stuff and just use something, and I would just go through and like make markings on it so I couldn't play it anymore. And then I would throw it off and I would just watch it get off and go really small and then just disappear. And then I'd ask myself a question that would get me onto the path that I wanted to happen. So part of the state is putting attention where you want it to go. Not that, to be clear, that doesn't mean that you ignore negative possibilities. It's just that you don't spend a lot of time having emotion and negative possibilities and diving down that, because that's not beneficial. You can definitely look at those possible scenarios and understand that there's threats that are real, but the fear that's in your mind is just something that you're creating, right? So that's important. But so I want to go where I want to go, right? I want to put my attention in where I want to go, because otherwise what I'm doing is I'm reinforcing the negative path when I'm literally rehearsing all those things in my mind. I'm literally creating new pathways to make that happen, right? And so I use those different kind of tricks where it was like, okay, this will help me get out of this spiral that I'm in, changing my focus and head in the path that I want to go. So that was a big part. And then language was one of the third part of the triad, which meaning is an element of that, but just the language and the way we use language is such an important part of our state. We'll often use words that over exaggerate what we're feeling, but then our feeling will go to the point of the language we're using. We can also do the same by using language that lowers our emotion, and do that purposefully in different ways. Whether it's maybe you want to actually heighten the emotion because it's a positive emotion that you're like wanting to experience more of, and so you can change just the word, and by changing the word, it changes your emotion. I'll use an example a lot of people do that are going up to speak on stage. A lot of times what people do when they're going to speak on stage is you'll hear the common thing that there's some butterflies in their stomach, right? And people, some people label this as nervousness, and hence they feel nervous. But there's been a lot of people, and there was a test done where they had a portion of the people label that as excitement, excited energy, where it was like, hey, this is like kind of, I'm excited. I got this like energy, excitement to go do this thing. Um, and it's just insane to see that like so many of those people were like, no, yeah, like I was excited before. And then the people who were labeling it as being like nervous and like basically they had anxiety around it. So the words we use are one of the things I often say is our words are our world. I said it right. Yes. Um, our words are our world. When we start to use all these words, each of those words has meanings associated with it, often layers of meanings in different contexts and all that kind of stuff. But so just by changing a word, you can change the entire context of a thing. And by changing that, it can often change the emotion for you. So, um, you know, instead of, if you have a certain thing where you get frustrated with people, and I'm just making up an example here, like You just have developed a pattern where you're getting frustrated with people out driving. That never happens, right? Um, and it's getting to a point where like you're getting frustrated and angry. Like you're one of those people in the car that's like yelling and cussing and hitting your car, and like it really only impacting you, right? But you think like, hey, I'm letting them know my feelings about this, which um, so if you're there, like just by using a word, and by changing the word as opposed to calling them some expletive, you could say silly or something like that, right? And so uh, it's funny because one of the things I still get frustrated with that I find funny is when you pull up to a four-way stop and the person on your right has the right of way, but they pull up even a little bit before you, and you pull up and you're waiting for them to go, and then they wave you on, and you, you, they're trying to be nice, right? But it's like, just follow the rules, just do the thing, and just go. And like, it works so much better if you just went, right? But it's just something I kind of laugh at now because it's just one of those things. It shouldn't really like frustrate me, but it's for whatever reason it still does. So, but in those situations, I start to laugh about it now because I think it's I think it's kind of funny at the same time. So I want to kind of wrap this together by talking about our beliefs, our biology, and our state, how those are all interconnected, right? It is it is life changing, and each one of those, if you improve in any one of those areas, it automatically elevates the others. So biology, let's just say you have been more sedentary and you haven't really gotten your body moving as much. Just by starting to walk more, like your state will get better just because you're more active. Your body needs to have a little, activity, right? And so, just by walking for 30 minutes a day or something like that, and you decide to do stacking, which I love stacking. I won't go into it a lot, but stacking is where one thing doesn't necessarily take away from the other thing, and they can be done together. It's like, I want to spend family time together and I want to go on a walk, and so we go on a walk as a family, right? Or I want to meditate and I want to go in the sauna, and so I meditate in the sauna. Or I want to go on a walk and I want to listen to this podcast. I can do both, right? So it's like there's a lot of those kind of things. And so maybe you're like, hey, I'm going to also feed my mind, and I'm going to learn while I'm doing this. So your state is probably like, it's one of the quickest things you can change once you understand that it's one of those things that is extremely easy to do once you learn how to do it, right? And it's not that like anyone could do it right now. Like if you just jumped up and acted silly and crazy, you would start laughing and you would feel kind of like like it was funny and like you're having a good time. Like that is just going to happen. Like you can try to force it where you're like, I'm going to try to not laugh. I'm going to try to not have fun, but I'm going to jump around and act silly. And you could do that and you would probably still end up laughing because that's kind of silly in and of itself. So understanding how to utilize your body, how to utilizing your focus, how to utilizing your language and the meaning to guide your state, it's one of the most impactful things that will change your life right away, because the way your state is your one of your lenses of the world. And so if you think about the different lenses that kind of come on and go, this state all of a sudden comes on, and you can start to see the world in different ways, because most people think they're seeing reality. And for most of us, we know that no one sees reality. Um, if you understand our base biology, understand how our perception works, we're only taking in a small slice of information. Even in what we visually see, we're only actually paying attention to a small percentage of that and taking that in, and then creating and filtering that through our past beliefs to create meaning, right? We are meaning assigning machines. And a lot of times we've built a lot of meanings that are not beneficial, and they're not beneficial for us. They're not beneficial for those around us, the world. And so when you find those things where it's like, hey, this is something that, like, judgment is a huge addiction. We're so addicted to judging others. It blows my mind. Like, and when I say that, I was one of the main perpetrators of this, like judging people. And but now it's to a point where it's like once you start to really understand the people's psychology, it's really hard to judge people, in that knowing that we've all gone through our own paths, we've all gone through our own traumatic experiences. It's just that we don't think we are, but we're coming from our own lens, we're coming from our own riverbed, right? Where we can't necessarily see their experiences, and we start to project things on them, often our own fears, our own anger, whatever it may be, and we create stories. And we do this without a lot of information, but it's something that we've become very addicted to, is that assigning judgment to others. And what's interesting is we often want others to just love and understand us. But in order for us to create the world that we want, we need to be the thing that we want, not just expect others to do what we want. We need to come in and be understanding and loving and compassionate, right? So I say that so that you know how impactful changing your state is. It is life changing. And if you've gotten to the point where you feel out of control of your emotions, this is an area I would practice on a lot. Because for a lot of people, they constantly feel like they're being bounced around like a pinball in a pinball machine, and things are just happening and they're hitting them, and they don't have a lot of control, and they're just in. You see this more in today's age, right? And we literally have the best quality of life we've ever had, ever. Like, we, if you compare 50 years ago, 100 years ago, not, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't make progress and there's not a lot to do, because there is 100%, but we're experiencing stress at a much higher level, though. And it's not because of our life conditions, it's because of our attention. And it's because people are all combating for your attention. And unfortunately, we're letting them manipulate us. As a marketer here that knows how to grab your attention and keep your attention and promote people to take action, right? Now, we do this in a way where we're aligning with companies that have integrity in serving the customers that they serve, that they're doing what they say they will do, right? So, that's important. But there's a lot of organizations, there's a lot of companies, there's a lot of groups that want your attention, and they all have their own reasons for doing that. And if we let other people do that, like guide our attention, we will constantly stay in that path. And they benefit by keeping us, by not keeping us because they can't keep us, but by reinforcing and us keeping ourselves in a path where we're feeling more controlled by outside stimulus, as opposed to having more of that internal control and not being so influenced by external stimulus, whether that's cutting down external stimulus, which, step one, cut down external stimulus. Like, when you're here with your spouse, when you're here with your team, when you're here with the client, you know, cut out external stimulus and be there, right? But make sure that the time that you're spending is aligned with what is truly valuable to you. And, you know, cutting out some of the news headlines, cutting out some of the social media, cutting out some of the technology where it makes sense, will allow you to better align that attention. But with that, that's all I have for today. I'm going to expand a lot more on this in the book. It's one of the most, it's a critical topic, and I think it's so valuable. But I really appreciate you listening, and I just encourage you to test this out for yourself, and uh, just keep being compassionate with yourself and allow yourself realize that it's not going to change overnight. So with that, I'll say have a great day.